Hey Joy family, happy Thursday. It is great to be able to come to you once again as we finish up our little devotional series this morning on the miracles of Jesus. And some of my favorite, not every miracle of Jesus, but some of my favorite miracles of Jesus. And through these miracles of Jesus, he reveals not only his power, his supernatural power as God in the flesh, but he also reveals who he is, something about himself and why he came. Through each of these miracles. So there's a lesson to learn in each of these miracles. They're not just, party tricks or something like that. But before we jump into our miracle for this morning, have a couple quick reminders for you. Tonight, ladies, is our Ladies Connection down in the park in the Dell. And then this weekend, we have Pastor Anthony, who serves as our youth pastor. We have a joint youth group between our church and New Covenant. So Pastor Anthony will be coming on over and speaking this Sunday, and it'll be a great time of worship. Also, if you're doing the diaper drop for the Swansons, everything's due this Sunday as well. So, and you'll see information about all that in the bulletin. You can get the bulletin online, either view it or download it online each week. But I think that's about all of the reminders to give you for right now. But in the meantime, our miracle this morning. Now, let me just set the setting for you. This is what the night Jesus is arrested. He's in the Garden of Gethsemane with his disciples, and he's praying, and he just prays. If you remember, not your will, but my will, or not my will, but your will be done, God. Where he's praying to God, and he's surrendering himself to what's going to happen now. He's going to be arrested. He's going to be tried. Even though he's innocent, he's going to be beaten, and then he's going to be crucified. All for us, to pay the price for our sin. And this was all prophesied. So he's in the garden, and he's praying. And he asks his disciples to watch while he's praying, yet they fall asleep. And then what happens is that Jesus scolds them a couple times, and then he scolds them the last time. And as he's scolding him, soldiers from the religious elite, the Jewish elite, come to arrest him, led by Judas, one of the 12 who had made a deal to betray Jesus. So it's interesting in this miracle of Jesus today that it's mentioned, this story is mentioned in all four Gospels, but to varying degrees. So I'm going to read out of Luke's Gospel, and it's in Luke chapter 22. So here's what happens with Jesus. It says, and while he was still speaking, there came a crowd, and a man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He drew near to Jesus to kiss him, which was a sign, right? But Jesus said to him, Judas, why would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? And when those who were around him saw what would follow, they saw that Jesus was going to be arrested by force, basically taken by force. And when they saw what would follow, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? Remember, Jesus had told them to carry a sword. So they said, is this the time we rise up and defend you with our sword? And then it says, and one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. Isn't that cool? We're just going to stop right there. And there's a lot of neat things happening here in this miracle. But again, it's this scene. It's this scary scene at night, in this garden where they have clubs and they have swords and they have torches, and they're all coming to arrest Jesus. And they're coming in force. So the disciples obviously are outnumbered here. Now, it's interesting. Luke doesn't mention who this servant is or who Peter who the disciple who did this with. And we learn that it's Peter in John's Gospel. Actually, Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't mention the name of the disciple who does this. Only John mentions that it's Peter. Now, why would he do that? Mark talks a lot about Peter, right? Because Peter had a huge influence. Well, there's one reason, and there's a very practical reason for this. When Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written, was at the height of Peter's ministry. So if they would have mentioned his name, it might have put off signal flags that, this guy Peter could be violent and we should watch him or we should arrest him or something like that, get him on the radar screen as being violent or something like that. So they just decided to keep it, anonymous. But yet John was written after all of that happened in one of the last Gospels written. So Peter wasn't in the kind of ministry, or wasn't in ministry at the time, so he could mention who it was, Peter. But he also mentions the servant. Malchus is his name, as we find in John. And that's very interesting, because this guy Malchus is the servant, and actually the word used for servant here is slave, to the high priest, Caiaphas. And so that's interesting. He's a slave. And his name Malchus, that's a very Greek name. So that shows that he's probably not Jewish. And he's brought in, and he's amongst this crowd, and he's a slave. Okay, again, people held slaves back in that day. You know, even the Jews, some of the Jews held slaves as servants. So this guy was probably like the personal servant, or the manservant of Caiaphas. And he's there. Didn't say he was violent, didn't say he was carrying a sword or anything like that. But what happens is Jesus is betrayed by Judas, and the disciples ask, you know, should we rise up our swords and defend you? And Jesus, there's a pause there before Jesus says no. And before he can even say, says no, Peter, who's always the impulsive one, takes out his sword and just swings it, right? And in swinging it, fortunately, he didn't hit this guy, Malchus, in the head and kill him, but he cut off his ear. Now, so imagine this scene, you know? It's this kind of weird situation, and then all of a sudden there's this violence happens. And Jesus breaks that violence, breaks that time where he reaches down, picks up the ear, puts it back on the guy, and the guy is healed. Okay? So, what is this about? Why is this even in there? Why is it, you know, what do we learn about Jesus from this? Well, we learn a couple things from it that are very interesting. First of all, if we look at Malchus, a slave, and Jesus comes to heal him, right, to touch him. Do you remember Jesus early on in his ministry? And actually Luke talks about it in Luke chapter 4, where Jesus goes into the synagogue and takes the scrolls of Isaiah, and he talks about, you know, I've come to give liberty to the captives. So in one sense, Jesus is caring for this man who's a slave, who's not even a Jew, and he's caring for them, and in a sense setting him free, okay? But really, it's more practical than that in one sense, because Jesus is also doing this miracle and stopping this because he doesn't want this to get violent. He's going to be tried. He doesn't want to get that to come to trial and say, well, these guys resisted, so then we're going to do worse. And then maybe they would have also taken the disciples in and said these guys were rebellious. Another reason why he didn't want them to be violent was that a lot of the uprisings of the Jews had become violent. In fact, this guy Barabbas that we learn about at the trial of Jesus was one of these violent revolutionaries. And Jesus coming and preaching the kingdom of God wasn't about overthrowing a government. It wasn't about overthrowing the Romans, right? It was about overthrowing sin and changing our heart and making us brand new. So for that, it wasn't violence. It was a sacrifice. So Jesus is putting the focus back on that. No, this isn't a violent thing. That we're going to do violence. Actually, you're going to do violence to me. You know? And he wanted to keep that focus on that because he wanted to keep the focus on everything that was happening there, on fulfilling the prophecy and his road to the cross, because that's why Jesus came. So almost this miracle was done to kind of calm tensions so that what needed to happen could happen uncluttered. So, and sometimes Jesus does that for us, doesn't he? Jesus removes things, removes the clutter from our eyes or from our minds. And sometimes we have a lot of things going on, and Jesus wants to remind us, you know what? Keep focused on what we need to keep focused on, which is Jesus, why he came, what he's done for us, and what he can do for those around us. So in this miracle, this neat miracle of basically, you know, restoring a severed ear, Jesus is reminding him once again, no, I came to save life, not to take life. And I want you always to remember that, because that is why I came. So be encouraged by this morning. Be encouraged by all of these miracles that we talked about, done by Jesus and through Jesus, that they all reveal who he is as God in the flesh and who he came to be for each and every one of us. Again, he didn't come to wow us with miracles. He came to pay the price for sin, to live the perfect life that we could never live, to pay the penalty for sin, which is death that none of us could ever pay, and come out surviving. And then he rose from the dead to give us new life. And that new life is through a relationship, and with a relationship with God as his child. And that relationship goes on forever and ever. And we get that relationship. We get all of who Jesus is and all Jesus has done. We get that by his grace. It's nothing in and of ourselves, but it's because he values us. It's his choice for us. And we receive that through faith. So be encouraged by this morning, and have a great week, Joy family. Have a great week walking in all that Jesus is.